by the president's budget.
How can you go from $33 trillion to $51 trillion and call that a reduction in the deficit?
Because that's a calculation for which you need a baseline, and then you compare the budget and the deficits and debt in the budget with a baseline in which there are none of the changes either in revenues or in spending that are proposed in the budget.
Here's my baseline. At the end of this year, we project, people a lot smarter than me, probably not than you, but smarter than me, say that gross debt's $33 trillion. They say if the president's budget is implemented by 2033, it'll be $51 trillion. Isn't that a fact?
If the president's budget is not implemented and none of the changes are made, it will be worse than that. And so the president's budget has improved the fiscal outlook relative to what we would have without the president's proposals.
Even though
Okay, you just saw that clip. Stay with me, because what you witnessed is one of the most important Senate hearing exchanges in recent memory, and most people completely missed it. I'm Your Name, and on this channel we break down politics the way it actually is. No spin, no fluff. And today, Senator John Kennedy just gave us a masterclass. Before we watch the full video, here's what hit me immediately. Kennedy walked in prepared. He had the numbers. He had the Fed's report physically in his hand. He had the Wall Street Journal article. This man did not come to shake hands and smile. He came with receipts. And Yellen? Decades in the highest offices of American economic policy. Federal Reserve Chair. Treasury Secretary. And she's sitting there saying she doesn't have those numbers in her head. On a budget she is supposed to be defending. In front of the American people. That should bother you. It bothers me. Lean in. Watch the full video with me, because by the end you're going to understand exactly why every American taxpayer should be paying attention to what Senator Kennedy is doing in that chamber. And if you're new here, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what comes next. Slowly. All right.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Madam Secretary.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary, isn't it a fact that the president's proposed budget for next fiscal year is $500 billion more than this fiscal year?
On the spending side?
Yes. That's what a budget is.
Yeah. It is about $400 billion.
It's about $500 billion more, right?
It's about what?
$500 billion more, right?
About that.
Isn't it a fact that since 2019 until today, I'm not including the extra $500 billion that y'all want to spend, since 2019 through today, U.S. population has increased 1.8%, and the federal government's budget is up 55%. Isn't that a fact?
Well, we had a pandemic.
Isn't that a fact, though? Are my numbers right?
I don't know those numbers.
You don't know? You never looked at that?
I don't have those numbers in my head. I'm not disputing them.
Okay. Isn't it a fact that the president's proposed budget proposes $4.7 trillion in new taxes?
It does propose significant additional taxes, yes.
4.7 trillion?
Something like that, yes.
Okay. You talked about reducing deficit. Isn't it a fact that under President Biden's proposed budget, that gross debt will rise from $32.7 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion by 2033?
I'm sorry, what number did you give me for?
The president's proposed budget will increase gross debt from $33 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion in 2033. Isn't that correct?
Well, debt held by the public, which is...
No, ma'am, that's gross debt. Isn't that a fact?
That's probably a fact.
So you haven't reduced the deficit, have you?
The deficit, the debt and deficits are reduced by the president's
How can
budget.
you go from $33 trillion
because-
to $51
because-
trillion and call that a reduction in the deficit?
Because that's a calculation for which you need a baseline, and then you compare the budget and the deficits and debt in the budget with a baseline in which there are none of the changes, either in revenues or in spending, that are proposed
Here's my
in the
baseline.
budget.
Here's my baseline. At the end of this year, we project, people a lot smarter than me, probably not than you, but smarter than me, say that gross debt's $33 trillion. They say if the president's budget is implemented by 2033, it'll be $51 trillion. Isn't that a fact?
If the president's budget is not implemented and none of the changes are made, it will be worse than that. And so the president's budget has improved the fiscal outlook relative to what we would have without the president's proposals.
Even though it raises gross debt from $33 trillion to $51 trillion, you say that's an improvement.
It is an improvement because it raises taxes by more, and it leads to...
That includes taxes. In what world is that an improvement, other than Washington and La La Land?
It's an improvement in that the revenue increases far exceed proposed investments.
Okay. All right, let me ask you this. Isn't it a fact that in January of 2019, the Federal Reserve issued a warning to Silicon Valley Bank over its risk management systems?
I have no idea. I'm not responsible in any way.
But you're in charge of the banking bailouts and the crisis, right?
I am not involved in banking supervision, and I don't have access to any information about the supervision of Silicon Valley Bank.
Okay, so you don't know whether or not the Fed, you haven't looked to see whether or not the Fed issued a warning, 4 years ago to the bank over its risk management systems?
That's not public information, and it's not
Sure it is.
information.
It's in the Wall Street Journal.
Well, it may be in the Wall Street Journal, but it's not public information, and it's not information that I have access to.
Well, I'll give you a copy of this article.
I've read the article, but
The Fed issued a matter requiring attention, and it said your risk management practices are terrible and you need to improve them.
that is what the article says.
Right. Isn't it a fact that months before SVB went under, that the bank disclosed that its mark-to-market value of its bonds was $16 billion less than their balance sheet value?
They did make such a statement.
Did the people at the Federal Reserve just not read it?
I'm not at the Federal Reserve.
I know.
I was at the Federal Reserve.
But you're at the Treasury, and you're in charge of the banking crisis. Let me ask you.
I am not in charge of the supervision of the bank.
Let me ask you this. Senator Heinrich talked about the 2018 amendments to the Dodd-Frank Act. Isn't it a fact? Now, SVB was not stress tested in 2022. 34 banks were. Here's the Fed's report. Isn't it a fact that if SVB had been stress tested, it would have passed?
Stress tests look at capital of a bank.
Here's the yes, ma'am, under the stress test. Isn't it a fact that SVB would have passed?
I don't know. It wasn't stress
You
tested.
need to look into that, Madam Secretary.
This is not my job. This is the Federal Reserve's job.
Okay, isn't it a fact that when the Federal Reserve stress tested in 2022, it only stress tested credit risk, it didn't stress test duration risk? Isn't that a fact?
I believe the stress tests in general partially address and take account of interest rate
No,
risk?
ma'am. I've read it. Here it is, bigger than Dallas.
Well, to the extent that there are assets held in an available-for-sale portfolio that would suffer losses due to changing interest rates, that would be captured in the bank's
No, ma'am, it's not
capital.
there. I've read it.
Senator Kennedy, I've allowed people the secretary to stray over answer.
We just watched the whole thing, and I've got a lot to say. First, Senator John Kennedy is one of the most underrated figures in American politics right now. The man has a law degree from Oxford. He is not the folksy Southern senator he sometimes plays on TV. That's a calculated persona. What you saw underneath it was a prosecutorial mind, methodically taking apart the testimony of one of the most credentialed economists in the world. Let's start with the budget numbers, because this is where it gets genuinely alarming. Kennedy established, and Yellen did not dispute, that the federal budget has grown 55% since 2019 while the American population grew less than 2%. Think about that for a second. The people grew by 2%. The government grew by 55%. Who is this expansion actually for? Because it's not keeping pace with the population. It's keeping pace with Washington's appetite. Then Kennedy lands the big one. Gross debt rising from $33 trillion to $51 trillion under Biden's own proposed budget. An $18 trillion increase. And Yellen's response? Well, it would have been worse without us. I'm sorry, what? That is the equivalent of a financial advisor driving your car into a ditch and saying, "Trust me, without my steering you'd have gone off a cliff." You don't get credit for a slightly smaller disaster. The debt is still going up by $18 trillion. That is not a win. That is Washington redefining words to avoid accountability, and Kennedy called it out perfectly. In what world is that an improvement other than Washington?
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about Silicon Valley Bank, because this is where Kennedy's questioning becomes historically significant. The Federal Reserve flagged SVB's risk management practices for years before it collapsed. For years. That is not a miss. That is a systemic failure of regulatory follow-through. And when Kennedy raised this, Yellen's response was essentially, "Not my department." Technically, she's right that banking supervision sits with the federal. But Yellen chairs the Financial Stability Oversight Council. She is literally the person whose job it is to look at the entire financial system and spot threats. SVB disclosed publicly that the market value of its bond portfolio was $16 billion, less than what was on its balance sheet. That information was available to anyone who bothered to read it. Did nobody in Washington read it? Kennedy's point, delivered quietly and almost conversationally, was devastating. The people responsible for watching the banks either weren't watching or they saw it and did nothing. Then the stress test argument. This one matters. The Fed stress tested 34 banks in 2022. SVB was not one of them. Kennedy's argument is that even if SVB had been tested, it would have passed because the 2022 stress tests only evaluated credit risk, not duration risk. SVB's entire problem was duration risk. They were holding long-term bonds that collapsed in value as interest rates rose. The stress tests were not designed to catch the exact thing that caused the collapse. Yellen pushed back, but Kennedy had the report in his hand. And whether you agree with his conclusion or not, the question is completely legitimate. Were the right risks being tested for? And if not, who is responsible for fixing that?
Pause.
Look directly at camera. Here is the real takeaway. Senator Kennedy represents something increasingly rare in Washington. A politician who treats a Senate hearing like it actually matters. Who prepares. Who reads the documents. Who doesn't accept a non-answer and move on. He was told repeatedly, "That's not my department, I don't have those numbers, that's not public information," and every single time he had a follow-up ready. He had already anticipated the deflection. You can disagree with his politics, but you cannot argue he wasn't doing his job in that room. He absolutely was. Direct close. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to see it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did Kennedy land his punches? Did Yellen hold her ground? Let's talk about it. Like the video if you found it valuable, subscribe if you're not already here, and I'll see you in the next one.